In this video, we're going to talk about the former West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm the Best Virginian. I bring you West Virginia history and travel videos from right here in the mountain state of West Virginia, and today we are going to be talking about a structure that has been featured in countless history shows, haunted paranormal shows, even makes an appearance in Fallout 76. Yes, today we're going to be talking about the former West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. I'm not going to go super deep into the gory details, literally the gory details, because there are a lot of darker sides of history when you're talking about places like state prisons. This is just going to be a general historical overview. So the history of the West Virginia State Penitentiary actually starts in 1863, right after West Virginia separated from Virginia to become its own state, which was awesome. But in the process, we inherited all of Virginia's public works projects. This included things like the housing and reforming of criminals. At the time, Virginia was using a series of county and local jails for housing its criminal population. When West Virginia inherited the system, they decided, for the most part, if it was good enough for Virginia, it's good enough for West Virginia. Except then Governor Arthur Borman, and I say then governor like there were other governors. At that point, the first and only governor West Virginia had, Arthur Borman, decided that he wanted to start pushing for a state prison. Most people didn't support this idea. They said, you know what, if it was good enough for Virginia, it's good enough for us. If there's particularly violent or, inmates that are prone to trying to escape, we'll just send them to other prisons in other states, higher security prisons like ones in Ohio, Pennsylvania, not Virginia, because they were still a little bit bitter about their recent breakup. Then in 1865, 9 inmates escaped one of these county jails. And not to let perfectly good outrage go to waste, like any good politician, Arthur Borman got right back on a soapbox about wanting a state prison, and this time he had way more support. So shortly after that, this new government of West Virginia bought a chunk of land in Moundsville for about $3,000. Now, you might be wondering, why Moundsville? Why not a more centrally located area? Why this chunk of land up in the northern panhandle of West Virginia? Well, because at the time, the capital was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and they wanted this prison to be close to the capital. Now, the West Virginia State Penitentiary was essentially going to be a slightly smaller version of the Joliet prison in Illinois. They were just going to shrink it down a little bit. At that point, the Joliet prison was really a fairly new state-of-the-art complex, and they were going to copy a lot of the elements. Now, the first structure to be completed at this facility was the Wagon Gate, and at that time, the only other structure in the area was a wooden stockade attached to the Wagon Gate. Now, during this time period, the inmates began working on the north and south cell blocks, the admin building, and the warden living area. And all the bricks that were used in the construction of the penitentiary were hand cut. And if you look really close, I'll throw up some examples of them here. Every single brick had some type of marking put into them by the inmates so that they could differentiate who carved them so that that individual could receive compensation for their work. You see ferns, you see stars, you see initials, you see Roman numerals, and it's just neat how even after all these years, you can still see signs of the original workers hand cut a lot of these stone bricks. In 1876, construction wrapped up, and 251 inmates were relocated to Moundsville for the grand opening of the penitentiary. In 1899, the first execution would take place at the penitentiary. In total, about 94 men would be executed in Moundsville before the state would eventually outlaw the practice in 1965. If you've ever done a deep dive into true crime in West Virginia, so many stories kind of intervene, and a lot of stories just flat out end at the West Virginia State Penitentiary. For example, you have individuals like Harry Powers, West Virginia's first serial killer. He was executed at the penitentiary for murdering 3 children and 2 women. You also have Edward Shue, the man who, by murdering his wife, essentially started the legend of the Greenbrier Ghost. Even Charles Manson, yes, notorious Charles Manson, has connections to the West Virginia State Penitentiary. His mother actually served time in the penitentiary, during which point, as a child, he lived with an aunt and uncle in McMacken, West Virginia, and later on, he would ask to be transferred to the West Virginia State Penitentiary just so he could be closer to family and really the area he grew up in. So in a way, I like to regard the West Virginia State Penitentiary as kind of the Arkham Asylum of West Virginia, and I'm Batman. The night is mine. The first executions done at the West Virginia State Penitentiary were performed by hanging, and you could come see them. They were open to the public. That's right, you could get a ticket, pack a picnic, and go down to the penitentiary and watch a good old-fashioned hanging. Until one particularly hefty inmate was decapitated in 1931. I wonder if the doctor ran up with a stethoscope to, like, make sure his heart had stopped beating. You know how they have to do that? Like, head's over there, body's over here. At that point, the penitentiary decided that they needed to kind of rebrand their executions. Of course, they were no longer available for viewing by the public, and they switched over to the electric chair. Meet Old Sparky. This was the electric chair that was used at the West Virginia State Penitentiary. It was actually designed and built by an inmate based off of one in, I believe, Ohio. And after he finished constructing it, he had to be transferred to another facility because, oh boy, were all the inmates really excited to hear that capital punishment had been reinstated in West Virginia. 9 men would meet their fate on the electric chair before the state again would repeal capital punishment in 1965. All in all, about 998 individuals would die at the penitentiary, 94 by execution, 36 by homicide. And many of these individuals were buried in the nearby Whitegate Cemetery, which is right outside of Moundsville. If you're interested in why the penitentiary has its own cemetery located outside the city limits and some of the laws that went into place to cause this, I did a whole video on it. I'll put a thingy to it up here. Check it out, and if this is something that interests you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. Now, in 1986, 11 corrections officers and 1 food service personnel was taken hostage during a riot. The inmates were demanding better living conditions, medical services, and a new cafeteria. The riot stemmed from abhorrent living conditions, especially in the cafeteria. So if you're familiar with the town of Moundsville, or really pretty much any town in the northern panhandle near the Ohio River, they tend to be very swampy. What had happened was, over time, as the building settled, it kind of shifted and pivoted. This was very detrimental to a lot of the key utilities that kept the penitentiary functioning, especially its water line and sewage systems. This is gonna get a little bit gross, but essentially sewage lines had kind of shifted to the point where it was fairly common for raw sewage to actually drip down from the ceiling into the cafeteria. There are accounts of rats actually running around the ceiling. Sometimes these rats would die, and parts of rats and maggots would also rain down on the inmates while they were trying to eat. In fact, R.J. Moore actually had to be brought in to negotiate with the inmates, because who better to negotiate with inmates than a felon? At this point, he was just governor. He would eventually become a felon himself. Now, eventually, the inmates would get their demands, it would come to a compromise, and the hostages would be released. The cafeteria was one of the last structures to be built connected to the original penitentiary. And the old cafeteria was converted to a full contact visitation area. I'll throw some pictures of it up here. As you can see, the Ninja Turtles, the super buff unicorn. In 1995, the prison cells were deemed inhuman due to their size and overcrowding, and the penitentiary had to close shortly after. Today, the penitentiary and its museum are available for tours, and it's been featured in pretty much every single ghost hunting show. Out of the Fire and Castle Rock were both filmed at the penitentiary, and like I said at the beginning of the video, it even made an appearance in Fallout 76 and in a Left 4 Dead mod called Moundsville Slammer. Now, I like to go back tour the penitentiary every 3 to 4 years, because essentially what's going on is your guide is trying to condense almost 150 years of history into a 90-minute walking tour, and then I come home and I try converting a 90-minute walking tour into a 10 to 15 minute video. Obviously, you learn something new every single time you go, depending on the interest and expertise of the tour guide. For example, up until this time, I never knew why there was a big white line painted on the wall of the penitentiary, the inside wall. And that's because at one point they started using khaki uniforms. Well, the khaki uniforms blended in with the tan brick walls. So instead of ordering all new uniforms, they grabbed a couple buckets of paint and on the wall and called it a day. So I hope you learned something today. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, because I love talking about West Virginia locations and West Virginia history in videos like this. And definitely, if you like it, share this video with your friends, especially if you have friends that are into the paranormal or Fallout 76 or just West Virginia in general. And until next time, don't forget to stay wild and stay wonderful. And I'll talk to you later.